All right, so we're in 11 honors, and we're talking about chapter 5. So they are, it's an involuntary reaction. He even says, if you'll find this on page 34, this answers the next question. Give examples to show how the youth is under the influence of group psychology. Would you read that, Delaney? That paragraph says, he suddenly lost concern for himself. Would you write next to that, foreshadowing? Because this foreshadows an event that happens later. He suddenly lost concern for himself, that little paragraph. This foreshadows something that happens later in the book. Let's see what happened. You see it's on page 34.
Oh. He suddenly lost concern for himself and forgot to look at menacing fate. He became not a man but a member. He felt like something of which he was a part, a regiment, an army, a cause, or a country, was in crisis. He was welded into a common personality which was dominated by a single desire. For some moments he could not flee, no more than a little finger can commit a revolution from a hand.
All right, so the question is, how is he part of group psychology? Well, it kind of answered it in the last question, but notice he says he forgot he was a member. He became a member. So he was just part of this whole, and he wasn't thinking as an individual. They were kind of thinking in unison. And this is actually a preview of what's to come, because he felt that something bigger than him, a regiment, an army, a cause, or a country, was in crisis, and they were wielded into like one personality. This is actually a good thing. If you're going to be a soldier and a good one, this is how you have to think. And so he does. Just underline this on the next page, the last sentence on page 35. There was a singular absence of heroic poses, the last paragraph on 35. What do you think? What does that say? There was an absence of heroic poses. Why is that significant? What did he expect war to be?
Very like heroic and brave, and like
Yes.
everyone was very like passionate.
And he doesn't see that. He says they don't look like heroes, and they're not talking like heroes, and they're just doing a job. And there's nothing very heroic about it. So they come, and we kind of skipped the rest of this. You read it, I hope. And they actually fought them off. And look at the last paragraph on page 38. That as he gazed around him, the youth felt a flash of astonishment at the blue, pure sky and the sun gleaming on the trees and fields. It was surprising that nature had gone tranquilly on with her golden process in the midst of so much devilment. It's a beautiful day. That he says it was surprising that nature just kept being nature despite this carnage that was going on down here. Why do you think that's an important comment? What does it say about nature?
Is affected by men.
Did you say is or is not?
It isn't affected.
Exactly. That nature it's not crying, it's not raining, it's not stormy, it's a perfectly lovely day. It could care less what these people are doing to each other. And that's part of, write down the word naturalism, because write it in your book. Naturalism. I'll write it too, so I won't forget. That whole idea that nature doesn't care about us, and no, it's nature, it's not God. He doesn't even talk about God, he talks about nature. So he doesn't even think of God as a person, he thinks of nature, and nature could care less about human behavior. It's ignorant. I should point out that, let's read it. Isabel, would you read for a few minutes? Chapter 6, and we'll decide how much you need to read for Thursday. And I'll probably give you a quiz. Please be prepared for one. What do you think?
A week and so he came gradually back to his position from which he could regard himself. For moments he had been scrutinizing his person in a dazed way as if he had never before seen himself. Then he picked up his cap from the ground, he wriggled in his jacket to make a more comfortable fit, and kneeling relaced his shoe. He thoughtfully moved
Okay, what does all that mean? What does he mean? It was over, the supreme trial had been passed, the formal difficulties of war had been vanquished, and he felt ecstasy of satisfaction. Why? Why does he feel that way?
He felt like he'd like the whole time he's been excited to try to be a hero and just be a hero and be brave. So I guess he felt kind of good about knowing that his first battle went really well and that
Yeah.
he survived. And
Yeah,
didn't do anything wrong.
and he thinks, remember, he was worried about it. He wanted to be a hero, but he wasn't sure he would be. Guess what he is? He's a hero, and he feels pretty good about it. What's wrong with his thinking? Can you probably anticipate that? What's wrong with his thinking then? It ain't over till it's over. It ain't over. And so he's got to do it again. What does that tell you about courage, or about manhood, or about adulthood, womanhood in your case?
There's always something new.
Yeah, and in order to consider yourself a successful adult, what is one aspect of that? Like, you may achieve one thing, but what do you haven't gotten there, so I'm not asking you to tell me something you haven't experienced, but given this idea that we think one event is going to turn us into a man or woman, and one event makes us, it makes us an adult. What do you think it's gonna be like? You've seen adults, you have parents, you've seen adults. What is life like in adulthood? Is it one thing that you accomplish, everything is just smooth going?
There's just a lot of problems and difficulties and things that you have to do all the time.
It's, part of it is endurance. So, with school, once you're in school, and I'm gonna miss that part of it. Like, oh, the school year is over, the week is over, the school year is over. You've accomplished something. You can kind of lay back, kick back, and then before something else happens. But adulthood's not like that. There's no, there's Friday, but there's no spring, there's no summer vacation except for the 2 weeks your dad gets, or that you might get. You don't get 2 months off to do whatever you want to. I'm just saying that this is so typical of human nature, that we think, we just do one thing, makes us a man. Would you read, Aurora? You all said, in fact, why don't you write, I would suggest, at least I'm asking you to write at the top, Henry Fights Part 2. I did the other one, Henry Fights Part 1. That was chapter 5. This is chapter 6, Henry Fights Part 2, because it's not more than 10 minutes, if that long, between the first time and the second time he fights. So, Aurora?
Is it he felt that?
Yes.
He felt that he was a fine fellow. He saw himself even with those ideals which he had considered far beyond him. He smiled in deep gratification. Upon his fellows he beamed tenderness and goodwill. Gee, ain't it hot, hey? He said
Affably means like cheerfully, pleasantly.
to a man who was polishing his streaming face with his coat sleeves. You bet, said the other, grinning sociably. I never seen such dumb hotness. He sprawled out luxuriously on the ground. Gee, yes. And I hope we don't have no more fighting till a week from Monday. There were some handshakes and deep speeches with men whose features were familiar, but with whom the young now felt the bonds of tied hearts. He helped a cursing comrade to bind up a wound of the shin. But of a sudden, cries of amazement broke out along the ranks of the new regiment. Here they come again, here they come again. The man who had sprawled upon the ground started up and said, gosh. The youth turned quick eyes upon the field. He discerned forms begin to swell in masses out of a distant wood. He again saw the tilted flag speeding forward. The shells which had ceased to trouble the regiment for a time came swirling again and exploded in the grass or among the leaves of the trees. They looked to be strange war flowers bursting into fierce bloom. The men groaned. The luster faded from their eyes. Their smudged countenances
Yes, faces.
and now expressed a profound dejection. They moved their stiffened bodies slowly and watched in sullen mood the frantic approach of the enemy. The slaves toiling in the temple of this god began to feel rebellion at his harsh tasks. They fretted and complained each to each. Oh, say, this is too much of a good thing. Why can't somebody send us supporters? We ain't never gonna stand this second banging. I didn't come here to fight the whole doom rebel army.
See what you did there? All right, Delaney.
There was one who raised a doleful cry. I wish Bill's mothers had trod on my hand instead of me treading on his. The sore joints of the regiment creaked as it painfully climbed into position to rule. The youth stared. Surely you thought this is impossible thing was not about to happen. He waited as if he expected the enemy to suddenly stop and apologize and return a moment. It was all a mistake. But the firing began somewhere on the regimental line and ripped along it with both directions. The level sheets of flame developed the great clouds of smoke that tumbled and tossed through the mild wind near the ground for a moment, and then rolled through the ranks as through a gate. The clouds were tinged in earth like yellow, and sun rays, and the shadow were a sorry blue. The flag was sometimes eaten and lost in the mass of vapor, but more often it is projected, sun-touched and
Resplendent.
resplendent. Into the youth's eyes there came a look that one can see in the arms of a gin horse. His neck was quivering with nervous weakness, and the muscles of his arms felt numb and bloodless. His hands too seemed large and awkward, as if they were wearing invisible mittens, and there was a great uncertainty about his knee joints. The words that the comrades had uttered previous to the firing began to reoccur to him. I would say this is too much of a good thing. What they take for us? Why don't they send supports? I didn't come here to fight the whole.
The whole doomed.
He began to exaggerate the endurance, the skill, and the lure of those who were coming. Himself reeling from exhaustion, he was astonished beyond measure at such recency. They must have been machines of steel. It was very gloomy, struggling against such affairs. Wound up perhaps into the fight until sundown.
Notice he overestimates the enemy. He says, they must be machines of steel. It was very gloomy, struggling against such affairs. In other words, he thinks they're like bigger than life because he feels so weak at this moment. Sarah? Well, by the way, do you think he's going to stand and fight or run away? What do you think he's going to do? He's been a hero for about 10 minutes.
Run.
You think he's going to run?
He's gonna run towards them.
Oh,
Okay.
that would be a heroic thing to do. See what he does.
He slowly. Are we
Yes,
good?
yes,
Okay.
that's right.
He slowly lifted his rifle, catching a glimpse of the thick spread field. He blazed at the cantering cluster. He stopped then and began to peer as best he could through the smoke. He caught changing views of the ground covered with men who were all running like pursued imps, yelling. To the youth it was an onslaught of redoubtable dragons. He became like the man who lost his legs at the approach of the red and green monster. He waited in a sort of a horrified listening attitude. He seemed to shut his eyes and wait to be gobbled.
Notice he calls them dragons and monsters. Again, he overestimates these guys.
A man near him, who up to this time had been working feverishly at his rifle, suddenly stopped and ran the house. The lad, whose face had borne an expression of exalted courage, the majesty of he who dares give his life, was at an instant smitten abject. He blinked like one who has come to the edge of a cliff at midnight and is suddenly made aware. There was a revelation. He too threw down his gun and fled, and there was no shame in his face. He ran like a rabbit. Others began to scamper away through the smoke. The
Have you paid any attention to the Crimean thing? Have you seen any of the pictures or anything, video?
Of the what?
I said Crimean, the Ukrainian thing. Have you seen any of the photographs? Did you know that, recently, end of last week, they were giving weapons out to citizens and teaching them how to use them? Had a grandmother learn how to shoot a, whatever it was, automatic weapon, just regular guys, fathers, husbands. Their college students are making Molotov cocktail. You know what those are? What are Molotov cocktails? Yeah, they're bottles usually filled with, like the wine bottle, whatever, filled with kerosene or gasoline. You stuff a rag in there, and when you're ready to throw it, you light it, and then you throw it. And when it hits, it explodes. It's just an incendiary type bomb, but there's no shrapnel or anything except the glass. That's what it's come to over there. The average guy, I just wonder how they will stand up when somebody starts shooting at them. Let me pick it up here. He's running. His name is Henry Fleming. As he ran, he mingled with others. So he wasn't the only one to run, and that was part of the psychology. He saw others running, and that caused him to run. He dimly saw men on his right and left, and he heard footsteps behind him. He thought that all the regiment was fleeing, pursued by these ominous crashes. This is one of the misperceptions he has. He thinks most of the men are running. In the flight, the sound of these following footsteps gave him his one meager relief. He felt vaguely that death must make a choice of the men who were nearest. The initial morsels of the dragon would be those who were following him. So he displayed the zeal of an insane sprinter in his effort to keep them in his rear. There was a race. Why was he glad there were people behind him?
They got shot first.
They'd be the first ones to get shot. As he, leading, went across the little field, he found himself in a region of shells. They hurtled over his head with long, wild screams. As he listened, he imagined them to have rows of cruel teeth that grinned at him. Once one lit before him, and the vivid lightning of the explosion effectually barred the way of his chosen direction. He groveled on the ground, and then springing up, went careering off through some bushes. He experienced a thrill of amazement when he came within view of a battery in action. What's a battery in military terminology? Yeah, it's a group, or it can be even one, artillery piece. There seemed to be in conventional moods, altogether unaware of the impending annihilation. The battery was disputing with a distant antagonist, and gunners were wrapped in admiration of their shooting. They were continually bending in coaxing postures over the guns. They seemed to be patting them on the back, encouraging them with words. Notice the personification, or at least metaphor. They seem like animals. The guns, at least, they're patting them, coaxing them, talking to them. The guns, solid and undaunted, spoke with dogged valor. The precise gunners were coolly enthusiastic. They lifted their eyes every chance to the smoke-wreathed hillock from which the hostile battery addressed them. The youth pitied them as he ran. Methodical idiots, machine-like fools. The refined joy of planting shells in the midst of the other battery's formation would appear a little thing when the infantry came swooping out of the woods. Now, typically in a war like this, you wouldn't see one gun by itself. You wouldn't see one artillery piece. It'd be a cluster of them. The face of a youthful rider who was jerking his frantic horse with an abandon of temper he might display in a placid barnyard was impressed deeply on his mind. He knew that he looked upon a man who would presently be dead. I got to give you something. I want you to do something. I want you to read the next, finish this. The next 40 pages. That's how much we've been reading, 40. That would put you about page 85. This is Monday. let's see, 40 pages for Thursday or Friday. I don't know what's going on with you guys, Thursday, Friday. All right, we'll do Thursday. All right, so chapter 7 through chapter 14, that's, okay, I got something that I want you to do for Wednesday. I want you to I want you to do this for Wednesday. We hadn't done vocabulary in a while. You do pretty well. Would you give that to Delaney? There's some on the back. There's 20 of them. Did you hear that? There's some on the back, so don't forget. I want you to write a definition, look them up, and a sentence. There are sentences, I didn't tell you where they were. You could actually find the sentences in the book. All these are from the book, but I'm not requiring that you use that sentence. Thursday, let me get this right.
I'm good. I didn't get to go on once.
We've already talked about this.
I actually never got.
We've already talked about that. I'm gonna change this. I'm gonna give you till Thursday, and
What do you want to read?
I'm gonna give you, you gotta read to page 85. And it's, what did I say, what chapters? Let me get this right. Chapters 7 through 14. So, because we've read 6, so 7 through 14. And vocabulary through Wednesday.
I'm about to talk about my views in history. You better back me up. I know everyone else. I don't know what to do about it.
Bring up. Oh my goodness, remember you guys Kyle, right?
All right, you get that, ladies? You get that, ladies? Vocabulary Wednesday, reading for Thursday. See you later.
Thank you, Mr. Powell.
You're very welcome.